Good evening. My name is Omar Bula Escobar. I'm going to talk about transnational organized crime, a very, very complex subject, which I would recommend that you listen to, because it affects everybody's lives. Everybody's lives, whether you are in North America, in South America, in Asia, in Africa, in Europe. I'm going to focus in particular on the political fate and the fate in terms of national security of North America, South America, and Europe in relation to transnational organized crime. A new phenomenon that people have to know because it has become one of the main priority in terms of global security, as reflected, for example, in the December 2017 National Security Strategy issued by the White House, where transnational organized crime together with jihadism are considered two of the biggest threats to Western society, to the US in particular, in regards to that strategy. I'll show a definition of transnational organized crime, basically what characterizes 21st century transnational organized crime, or TOC, T-O-C, is the fact that it transcends borders and it's interconnected between borders. It covers the globe as a whole, and you can find criminal activities linked, or the link of criminal activities between the Middle East and drug cartels in South America, or the cartels in Afghanistan with cartels in Africa. Basically, the world has globalized, but those that have taken much more advantage of globalization are criminals, and global criminals. They have taken advantage of technology. They have taken advantage of loops in governance in poor countries. We will see furthermore what this means. Of course, the activity that, the preponderant activity here is drug trafficking. It constitutes at least 60% of transnational or of TOC worldwide. But there's also weapons trafficking, which is often the mirror commodity when we deal with drugs. We exchange drugs for weapons often, as South America does with African countries and others. There's also illegal mining, a growing problem in terms of crime, fueling wars like the one in DRC, in Congo, where coltan is the commodity which everybody is behind, as uranium in South America, as gold in certain areas where there is no governance and where the mafias or the crime is taking advantage of the riches that these produce. Other activities which are probably much more uncomfortable to all of us are those related to humans, human trafficking, human organ trafficking, human slavery. The volumes are enormous. I'm sure you have heard or read during the past years how human slavery has become a modern problem, and how the mafias of the different continents are exploiting precisely these channels that they share in order to perpetrate their crimes. Technology, of course, has helped global crime enormously. Financial transactions are faster. There's what we call the deep web, where many things are happening that we don't know about. There's technology used in radars, technology used in GPS, submarines that are being fabricated in South America, in the Pacific coast of South America, to transport cocaine, heroin, and even humans into the United States and into Europe in many cases as well. So the problem is extremely complex, and I think the importance is to see its global coverage. The map that you see there is probably very insufficient in terms of showing the actual complexity of the issue. But you can see that the world is linked. We're linked. You can find cocaine from the FARC in New Zealand at enormous prices. You can find Afghan heroin in the States. You can find South American cocaine in Africa. And all these channels, if the cooperation between criminal organizations is not permanent, like the case of FARC and Hezbollah, which are in the business of drug trafficking, it can be sporadic. They could use basically subcontracting, the subcontracting of services of other organizations, like for example when the Hezbollah hired the services of Zeta, or one of the drug cartels in Mexico, of a Zeta killing machine, a man, to hit the Saudi ambassador in Washington. So you could see a link already between crime in the Middle East, crime in Latin America, and its repercussions in North America. The proportions are scary. As you can see in the map that I have behind me, and you can see it better in full screen, only cocaine going from South America and cocaine going from South America to North America, and cocaine going from South America to Europe through Africa amounts to some $70 billion. Unfortunately, that red circle is on top of my region, our region, South America, which is indeed one of the main victims of these atrocious phenomena that is hitting the world as a whole. We will see also some proportions which can show you the magnitude of crime. Yes, please. The net value of transnational organized crime, of TOC, per year is of $2.1 trillion. $2.1 trillion. If you recall, in 2008, when there was the global financial crisis, there was a lot of talk about a trillion plus being spent by the Obama government at that time to be able to save banks and corporations which were hit by the crisis. Well, this was once in 2008. We're talking of, in terms of TOC, we're talking of 2.1 trillion annually, and indeed growing, because the world is doing very little about it. We are glad that the US, in its new strategy, has included transnational organized crime as one of its main priorities. Drugs within this are $322 billion, compared to the GNP of Colombia, for example, which is $290 billion. Drugs would be producing more than Colombia, a middle-income country. Therefore, the phenomena must be taken into account. Here is another image with some proportions. There's other activities as well. There's counterfeit products going to the Mediterranean, from northern Africa to the Mediterranean. There is a counter mixed with humans, which are put in the same boats and being transferred from coast to coast, be it not only the Mediterranean, but also between South America and Africa, and then into Europe. This is constant. This is happening as we speak. This is not a phenomenon that you will see in a snapshot. No, this is a permanent phenomena, which is a growing phenomena, and should be known by everybody in terms of taking their own decisions, in terms of, for example, in the case of Europe, of immigration, in the case of drug consumption, in the case of corruption, institutional corruption, and in other aspects of it. The difference between crime nowadays and crime in the past is that the structures have changed. You used to see mafia organizations as being very... It's no longer the case. There's a hybrid type of structure. Yes, hierarchical in certain sense, but also very complex, and it's basically a web of connections. In the case of the Familia Michoacana, 800 different connections at different levels, which includes different actors than in the past. This has changed because beyond crime itself, transnational organized crime in its size has actually turned the enterprise of crime into one that penetrates governments, penetrates democracies, and therefore creates the conditions for crime and criminal activities to be able to develop further. There is a systematic intrusion in many South American countries in educational institutions, the army, the police forces, the democratic institutions, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial, and also links with the private sector. The amounts of money which are involved are so big, and the amount of money laundering involved is so big, that it is very difficult for these other actors, which they're called gray actors. We might see the next slide, which are today called what we call the gray actors. The gray actors. Before we had a definition of a division between the good and the bad, the criminals and us, right? This has changed. The gray actors are those that keep a foot on one side, on the legality side, but also on the illegal side. And that makes things much more difficult. These gray actors include very often financial corporations and banks, but also many politicians and armed forces, which is the case of countries in South America right now. One of the most scary nexus, and I think this concerns North America, and South America in particular, is the nexus between crime and drugs, the terror crime nexus. Indeed, some of the so-called narco-socialist nations in South America have linked up with radical Islam organizations in the Middle East. Not only, as mentioned before, Hezbollah is in the business of exporting cocaine through Africa in junction with FARC, but you have other activities that have been developing across the Atlantic Sea. For example, the repercussions of Hezbollah and proselytism in places like the south of Mexico, the north of Colombia, the north of Venezuela, and little by little, yes, even though we are probably the region, South America and Latin America as a whole, is probably the region least affected thus far by radical Islam, things are beginning to build up. As you can see here, we have what we call the arc of instability in the northern part of Africa. The countries of the Sahel, the countries of northern Africa, including Libya today, which is in total chaos, are key in terms of being the recipients of drugs from the Colombian cartels and from Venezuela, out of the Venezuelan coasts. These drugs arrive in northern African countries like, and in western Africa in countries like Guinea-Bissau, like Senegal, like Mali, etc., etc. And this is what we call now the arc of instability. Northern Africa and the Sahel are flooded with drugs. There's Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, which is there, which receives the drugs. And the big problem, and now we go to Europe, is that those drugs that are received in Africa are received by what we call the narco-jihadis. Narco-jihadis are those that have as a mission the jihad, but are also involved in drug trafficking for organizations like Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda, and of the like. So there is a link between what's happening in Colombia and Venezuela and what's happening in Europe, not only in terms of the flow of drugs into Europe, but also the flow of migrants and the eventual flow of terrorists within these migrant masses. Here's again a map showing what I was mentioning, the route, the cocaine route, air cocaine called by many countries involved, including other terror organizations like in Western Sahara, the Front Polisario. Basically, Africa is in trouble in terms of transnational organized crime, and very few countries are spared. Here's a quick image for those in North America. This is a picture of a map of the flow of transnational organized crime into America. It has many facets, of course. One of the most known by Americans is MS-13, or the gangs of Central America. And of course, this has to do a lot with those decisions that are being taken in the U.S. in terms of national security, with building or not building a wall, with prohibiting the entry of illegal immigrants, of course, dealing with immigration, which, as we all know, is one of the main issues that have been discussed by the American government and its parties right now. We come to an organization called Foro de Sao Paulo. Please listen carefully. A very low-profile organization, but as it is low-profile, it is very, very, very powerful. The Foro de Sao Paulo was created by Fidel Castro, the Cuban dictator, and Ignacio Lula da Silva, who was in fact yesterday condemned again by a court in Brazil for embezzlement and for graft. It was created in 1990 as a result of the end of the financing of the Soviet Union of all the guerrillas in South America. What were they to do? They had no more finance, more funds, more financing sources coming from the old Soviet Union. So gradually, they organized. It includes all the left, the so-called leftist parties of Latin America. It includes FARC. It includes criminal organizations, and it has been behind every single political event that has happened in the southern in the southern part of the Western Hemisphere in the last 20 years. Chavez came to power through the Foro de Sao Paulo. Correa in Ecuador came to power through the Foro de Sao Paulo. Evo Morales came to power, and FARC is very close to power in Colombia thanks to the Foro de Sao Paulo. As called by Olavo de Carvalho, which is probably a Brazilian writer and journalist who has written a lot about the Foro and investigated a lot about the Foro de Sao Paulo, is probably one of the most sinister organizations, the biggest as well in terms of its reach and magnitude, and one of the most worrying in terms of the link between politics and terror. So we have here a mix of politics and terror, where ideology goes into the back burner. What are the results? Well, the results you can see in Venezuela. I don't. This is only one slide about Venezuela. Venezuela is a disaster. Is in chaos. One of the richest countries in South America, 30, 40 years ago, is now probably amongst the poorest. I don't have to illustrate much more than by saying it's the poorest country in the region, together with Haiti, the most violent capital city in the continent, hundreds of thousands of deaths, lack of food, lack of medicine. This is the results of those governments that have been sponsored by the Foro de Sao Paulo, the aforementioned organization. And now we come to FARC. FARC, the one that signed an alleged peace process with the Colombian government. To begin with, I'll make a little parenthesis here, in the sense that the world should know that the Colombian people rejected the agreement with FARC. It has, however, gone forward with the support of the Foro de Sao Paulo and other external forces. FARC is one of the main actors of transnational organized crime worldwide, and one of the main actors of the Foro de Sao Paulo. What is happening in Colombia, as a matter of fact, is transnational organized crime taking over a democracy, and in the name of peace. What happened to FARC, to Sendero Luminoso, the Shining Path in Peru, and other organizations during the 90s was that they were indeed organizations which enjoyed some type of ideology in the past, but as they had to reach other sources of financing, clearly that ideology diminished in time and the criminal element grew in time. So what we have today in case of FARC, although it's called a political party, it's in reality an enormous drug cartel, the second largest criminal organization in the world, according to some accounts. And we're talking of billions and billions of dollars being invested around in the whole region and beyond, in Europe and Africa included. And there's more in terms of South America, and in terms of the security, in this case of North America. I've written books about, one book that people might have heard of is Watch Your Backyard. And this talks about TOC, but talks also about Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, and its role in this context. Iran has been here for years, starting by the bombing in 1994 in Buenos Aires, which killed, were at a Jewish center called Amia, with 85 dead and many, many wounded. But Iran then came back with Ahmadinejad, came in 2005, several visits paid to Hugo Chavez. Venezuela opened the doors of Iran in the continent. They were still under sanctions at the time, and it was a way for Iran to try to alleviate the pressure it had in terms of the world trying to prevent that it develop a nuclear weapon. Iran is very present in Latin America. There's at least 40,000 Iranian agents in the region. There's even a missile base in the Paraguaná Peninsula. All of these facts can be verified. Everything can be verified. And that's one of the worries, of course, of the current government of Donald Trump regarding Venezuela. It's not Venezuela per se. It's that Venezuela is harboring Iran, is harboring Hezbollah, and therefore it constitutes a geopolitical threat to the United States, as it is right in on its backyard. Islam has been in the Caribbean for many, many years, but lately things have evolved. You might have heard that Trinidad and Tobago is probably the first place where ISIS has stepped foot in the region. More than 120 ISIS recruits have gone to Syria and came back. This was reported by the now Chief of Staff, General John Kelly. And there's already a lot of movement within these islands where communities where Muslim communities that settled before are changing in nature and might be beginning the same process of convincing of new recruits to join the jihad. So the Americas are not exempt of the jihad, and South America is becoming one of their training grounds. This is a map that shows the presence, also a very grosso modo map that shows the presence of FARC in the whole continent. FARC is everywhere, from Mexico down to Argentina. But we can also see some of the Hezbollah bases, of the Al-Qaeda bases, and these are growing. These are growing. The links are growing in South America, unfortunately, with record levels of cocaine production, is providing the perfect fertile grounds for all these criminal activities to develop. I think there is a big myth, the myth when we think about the left and socialism in Latin America, or calling Hugo Chavez a socialist, maybe Chavez at the beginning, but calling governments like the government of Maduro a socialist government. This is a label, basically, right? An etiquette, socialist, communist. Well, basically, I decided to revise the content to see what was there, what there was really behind, and got to the conclusion that what there is in Latin America right now is narco-populism, is crime ruling, is drug trafficking ruling due to its sheer size. And therefore, what we see when we talk about socialism, communism, and we see it in the press worldwide, is in reality a disguise for an ideological disguise that allows these countries to remain as legitimate nations, if you like. So I heard yesterday, and I had said it myself before, these are no longer neither democratic nations nor nations that should be part of the communities of nations, given the fact that they are now criminal-based. And this is not only in South America. Venezuela is a case, but you have others in Africa as well. The Obama era was very unfortunate for South America and for Latin America. Not only did we know that Obama made a rapprochement with Cuba, which is, we love the Cuban people as Latins, but we don't particularly like the Cuban government or the Cuban dictatorship, with a very, very cruel, with very cruel precedents. That approach, supposedly to solve problems with Cuba from the Obama government, was in fact disastrous for other countries like Venezuela, like Colombia, like Ecuador, because Cuba has had an expansionist strategy based precisely on corruption and criminal sources during the last 20 years. Therefore, like the European Union does today, supporting Cuba is basically killing Venezuela. You cannot do both. And this is something that I believe the United States now understands, but Europe seems to be unclear about it. International organizations, sorry, can we go back? Thank you. The multilateral organizations in Latin America have basically degenerated, to say so. The OAS is no longer taking decisions that actually promote democracy, as it's mentioned in its charter. The UN has not contributed to these, has actually gone with the story that has been portrayed by crime, which is also, by the way, the owner of the big media, and they are actually very strangely playing against democracies in Latin America and allowing for this space for crime to develop irrestrictedly. So we have different layers. It's important that we see the layers that we have on top of us nowadays. We have the lower layer where you see the yellow, where that's us, the mortals. On top of us, there's local criminal organizations. There's other countries entering the different regions, now referring to South America specifically. We have higher layers with big financial corporations involved, earning billions of dollars due to the chaotic situation in terms of institutionality and in terms of surveillance of these proceeds of drugs and other crimes. And there's a higher layer still, which is the one that many now know, fortunately, which is the power behind the power, as somebody call it some call it in Spanish, el poder detrás del poder. Indeed, in the case of South America, we have a clear presence of George Soros during the last 2 decades, alliances with FARC, intervening in elections, in electoral processes, funding of many NGOs which are pushing his agenda. And fortunately for democracies in Latin America, the candidate that he supported in the United States, namely Hillary Clinton, did not make it to power because clearly that was the road. That is the road that Latin America was less advised to take, which is the one of open borders, open immigration, open drug trafficking, and basically liberalism at its best, with not even the minimal concern for national security or personal security. So we're now with the Trump era. As I told you before, I personally welcome, I know many people welcome, the fact that Donald Trump is the president of the US right now. In as much as it concerns us, this is what Latin America needed. A focus on Cuba, a dictatorship which is contaminating the region. A focus on Venezuela as a country which is harboring Iran, Hezbollah, and other rogue nations, even links with North Korea, links with of course, African insurgent groups like Boko Haram, etc. All this spaghetti of linkages, which has now been discovered, and which, fortunately, again, I repeat, the United States has been able to see through. That is not the case, I repeat, for Europe, which has been very deceiving in terms of its position vis-a-vis democracy in Latin America. As I mentioned, here you have the national security strategy, just to show you an image. You can show the next image, indeed. Thank you. Where there's the arrow, you can see this is the index of the U.S. national security strategy, and you see the highlights of the jihadism and TOC, transnational organized crime. Please keep this in mind. I think that people should know more about it. Let us close with a rather folkloric image. This is the airport of Caracas, Venezuela. And these are not exactly Venezuelans, which are there. I don't have anything against the Muslim people. I have Muslim friends because I lived for 30 years abroad and in many, including Muslim countries. But I do have a problem with radical Islam and with any type of radicalism, in this case the one of Islam, which is penetrating the entrails of our countries and maybe destroying the little democracy that we had been able to build in the past. To finish up, these are my 2 books. The objective was not to promote them, but those that are interested, El Plan Maestro, written in Spanish 5 years ago, and Watch Your Backyard, which is the book that probably the most updated in terms of the very rapid evolution of the situation, of the geopolitical situation in the 21st century. I want to thank you very much. I hope that it has not been too long. You're welcome to contact me. I'm in Twitter at Omar Bula, and I'll be happy to discuss further. I hope that this has been fruitful to you. Thank you very much.